War is, as has been well documented, about as close to hell on earth as one can get. Yet, out of these terrible conflicts, there are always glimmers of humanity that shine through in even the darkest of moments. In times of difficulty, turmoil, and loss, we look for goodness, hope, and joy. And sometimes we find them in ways we never expected, in a friendly word, or even in a small act of kindness. And so today, we get to look back on the story of a man who used what little he had to be a light in the darkness and brighten up the days of grateful children caught in a conflict not of their own making. This is the story of Gail Halvorsen, who was known to the children of Berlin as the Schokoladenflieger, or the chocolate flyer, Uncle Wiggly Wings, or the most widely known of all, the candy bomber of Berlin. These are the strange but true stories from a history of conflict that you never learned about in school. I'm your host, Nick Charlie Key, and this is the wild history of war. Before we jump into today's story, if you love the wild history of war and you want to help me keep finding and telling these ridiculous stories, well, you can help support the show on Patreon across a few tiers, starting from as little as $2 a month. As a member, you can get new episodes early and ad-free, exclusive bonus mini-episodes, your name shouted out right here on the show, and you can even become a part of the podcast yourself by sending me your favorite strange but true wartime facts. I'll read them out. Or you can even record yourself telling us the fact and I'll feature it in an upcoming episode. So get some extra wild history of war, help keep the show going, and maybe even hear yourself on it too. So join me at patreon.com/wildhistoryofwar. Right, on with the show. Gail Seymour Halvorsen was born in Salt Lake City on October 10, 1920, to Basil and Luella Halvorsen. He grew up on small farms, first in Idaho and then in Utah. He attended Utah State University, and while there, earned his private pilot's license under the non-college civilian pilot training program in September 1941. Once he had his license, he soon joined the Civil Air Patrol as a pilot. Only a few months later, Halvorsen decided to join the United States Army Air Forces in May of 1942, and was just 22 years old when he arrived in Oklahoma to begin his training. He was assigned to a squadron to train with 25 aviation cadets and 77 Royal Air Force cadets at the No. 3 British Flying Training School. After completing his pilot's training, he returned to the Army Air Forces and was assigned flight duties in foreign transport operations in the South Atlantic. Once the Second World War was over and the Cold War had begun to set in, he was ordered to report to Germany on July 10th of 1948 to be a pilot for what is now known as the Berlin Airlift. At the end of the war, Germany had been divided into 4 separate and distinct zones of occupation. Each of America, Britain, France, and Soviet Russia laid claim to a quarter of the country. In yet more unnecessary confusion, the bombed-out capital of Berlin, which fell entirely within the Soviet-controlled section, was itself further divided by the 4 nations, with the Soviets claiming control of the entire eastern half of the city. As the Cold War began and the other 3 nations combined their territories into one single functioning economic zone, the Soviets began to fear that the Western forces would try a takeover of their East Berlin territory. So, in 1948, they began blockading and eliminating all access routes via rail, road, and canal into the Allied-controlled western half of the city. A potentially unintended consequence of this action, or if intended makes it crueler than necessary, was that the population in that half of the city now had no means by which to bring in medicine, fuel, coal for heat and electricity, or even fresh food. 2.5 million people slowly began to run out of these essential items, and their prospects for the future were looking grimmer with each passing day. But all was not lost for them, as there was one route into Berlin which had not been closed off, and that was the sky above them. In fact, back in 1945, as the war ended and the country was being divided up, no plans had been made with regards to safe passage along ground routes from the Allied-occupied territory in West Germany to their enclaves in West Berlin. This was not the case, however, when it came to agreements with regards to aerial routes. It was on the 30th of November 1945 that they had agreed that there would be 3 20-mile-wide air corridors through which the other 3 nations could freely access Berlin. This was agreed ostensibly to fly in any sort of aid packages to their territories, and unlike tanks, trucks, and other armaments, the Soviets couldn't claim to feel threatened by simple cargo aircraft ferrying goods back and forth. It was because of this pre-agreed concession that the idea of the Berlin Airlift was first brought to the table. The Allied forces couldn't sit back and watch their troops and the people in their territories starve or freeze to death, and so swiftly began planning a way to get supplies into the territory. The British had themselves even begun a smaller, more targeted airlift of their own to support just the British troops in Berlin. And so, when the American forces came calling with a request to work together in a joint airlift operation, the British could bring concrete numbers to the table when it came to the amount of resources that would be required to support the entire city. It was calculated that for each adult, they would need to provide a daily ration of just under 2,000 calories worth of food. And when that number was times by the population in the city, it came out at a staggering figure. Now, I hope you will bear with me in this next section, but each day they would need to fly in 646 tons of flour and wheat, 125 tons of cereal, 64 tons of fat, 109 tons of meat and fish, 180 tons of potatoes and sugar, 11 tons of coffee, 19 tons of powdered milk, 5 tons of fresh whole milk for consumption by the young children, 3 tons of yeast for baking, 144 tons of dehydrated vegetables, 38 tons of salt, and 10 tons of cheese. That is a frankly ridiculous amount of food. And bear in mind, that only lasted for 1 day. All in all, when calculated all together, that amounts to over 1,500 tons of supplies each and every day to sustain the over 2 million people. And yet, even this paled in comparison to the 3,500 tons of coal, diesel, and petrol required for daily heating, electricity, and fuel. Initially, one might think the problem would be sourcing all of these goods. But in fact, the bigger logistical issue was how to transport roughly 5,000 tons a day, when at that point they only had enough aircraft to transport around 700 tons a day, and that was if all went smoothly. The United States, Britain, and Australia joined forces to make this airlift supply to Berlin a reality. It took some time to put all of the logistical plans in place, but soon hundreds of planes were being flown in to aid the effort at hand. As day one of the airlift began and the myriad of moving parts all began to align themselves, they were only able to send just 90 tons of supplies. By week 2, however, they were up to 1,000 tons a day and becoming more and more efficient with each round trip. More than 1,000 aircraft were involved in the supply chain back and forth, and so some very efficient planning was needed in order to make sure they could all safely fly there and back without crashing into one another. They came up with an amazing strategy. Well, due to there being 3 corridors within which they could safely fly, they would all set out northeast through the American corridor, landing at Tempelhof Airport. Then, having offloaded their cargoes, they would return due west via the British air corridor. Once they safely reached British airspace, they would return to their respective bases for restocking. Many aircraft didn't even waste time with landing and would simply parachute their coal supplies directly onto the airfields and then return home again. Some specialized waterplanes were even brought in that could land on the Havel River, and due to their corrosion-resistant hulls, they were the perfect vessels to deliver baking powder and salt into the city. The next problem they faced was that they had aircraft taking off every 4 minutes, and due to the narrow airspace, they began having to essentially stack the aircraft in the sky so as to ensure their safety. Each plane that took off would fly 1,000 feet higher than the flight in front of it, beginning at 5,000 feet, and then repeating 5 times before starting again from the bottom. This system would later come to be known as the ladder. Gail Halvorsen reported for duty in July 1948. He had remained in military service even after the war, as he had hoped at some point to see combat. Even though he had served in World War II, he was assigned the task of ferrying bombers and transport planes across the South Atlantic Ocean for the European and North African campaigns, all of which turned out to be combat-free missions. When the war was over, he was sent to a base in Alabama, and when the military began looking for willing and able pilots to support the Berlin Airlift mission, Halvorsen was eager and willing to help. He began his supply runs with the other pilots and was drawn in by the beauty of a country dragging itself out of a devastating war. He was so enamored by Berlin itself, in fact, that even on his own personal time off, he chose to tag along on a flight into Berlin so that he could make short mini-movies with his personal handheld camera. It was this act in particular that would change the course of his life, and the sentiment behind the airlift in general, forever. We're going to take a short break, but when we return, we're going to see how one man's compassion would forever leave an indelible mark of kindness on the lives of thousands of German children. It was on the 17th of July 1948, just a month into his new role, that he touched down at Tempelhof Airfield, and, seeing a crowd of children gathered at the end of the runway, walked over to see them and to see what they were up to. When he reached them, he introduced himself in his best broken German, and they began asking him all sorts of questions about the aircraft and their flights in and out of the city. He spoke to them for a while as best he could, and then, just before heading back to the plane, he felt around in his pocket for something to give the children as a parting gift. All he had was 2 sticks of Wrigley's Double Mint chewing gum. The children's eyes widened, and the boy who received the gum from him quickly set about dividing it up equally amongst all the children who were present, even passing the gum wrapper around for the other children to smell. None of the children fought over the gum and were overjoyed to taste even the tiniest of slivers. Halvorsen was so impressed by their manners and their gratitude that he promised the children the next time he flew over the city, he would drop off some more sweets for them. As he was leaving, one of the children said, "There are so many aeroplanes flying overhead each day. How will we know which one of them is you?" He simply replied, "Don't worry, I'll wiggle my wings." Morning dawned the following day, and Lieutenant Halvorsen remembered his promise to the children at the airfield. He told his co-pilot and engineer of his plan, and together the 3 men pooled their candy rations for the upcoming drop. Halvorsen began packaging up the candy stash into 3 separate packages, and, realizing that the bundles were quite solid and heavy, he made 3 little parachutes out of handkerchiefs which he attached to each bundle to make sure that the falling candy didn't hurt any of the children. They loaded up the plane with the cargo for the drop, and Halvorsen made sure to keep the 3 little packages with him on his lap. Once everything was ready and they were given the green light to take off, Halvorsen lifted his craft into the sky and turned towards Berlin. After a while, he could see the city in front of him and began his approach toward Tempelhof Airfield. As he drew closer, he began to notice a small crowd of children gathered just outside the airfield gates. They had been waiting for him to arrive. He put his hands on the controls, and as he neared them, he shifted it first left and then right, wiggling the aircraft's wings to signal his arrival to the children. He slid open his window and dropped the packages to the jubilant children eagerly waiting below. Naturally, word got around the base of what he and his team were doing, and soon pilots, engineers, and other air servicemen were donating their candy rations to Halvorsen to drop on his missions into the city. Each and every day that Halvorsen flew into the city, the number of children waiting below grew and grew. Eventually, it got to the point where Halvorsen had too much to carry in one trip, and so he enlisted the help of other pilots to drop the candy as well. They, of course, agreed, and all would go through the same ritual of wiggling their wings and then dropping the parachute packages out of the window to the waiting children below. Well, before long, the airbase became inundated with letters from children with special requests for certain types of candy, and even more just wanting to say thank you to the pilots for the treats they dropped each day. An especially amusing letter arrived one day from a 9-year-old boy named Peter Zimmerman. In the letter, he had included a homemade parachute and a map to his own house so that Uncle Wiggly Wings could make a special delivery directly to him. Halvorsen was enamored with the letter, and so, on his next flight, tried his best to follow the directions given to him by young Peter, but to no avail. It wasn't 3 days later that another letter arrived from young Peter Zimmerman, which simply read, "No chocolate yet. I thought you were a pilot. I even gave you a map. How did you guys win the war, anyway?" Halvorsen, instead of being offended by this letter, took it in good spirits, and to make sure that the audacious Peter Zimmerman received his share, mailed a chocolate to his home address. As word of Halvorsen's candy bombs spread, his superior officers realized the potential for some good PR from all of it, and in January of 1949, they flew him home to do somewhat of a press tour. The news had spread across the United States, and supporters across the country were eager to help in any way they could. 2 notable interactions he had while back home was meeting a housebound woman named Dorothy Groger, who, inspired by his actions, had enlisted the help of her network of friends to sew thousands of tiny parachutes for the candy bombers to attach to the packages. In an even more impressive display was the work of a group of school children from Massachusetts who, through their efforts, were able to prepare over 18 tons of candy, chocolates and chewing gum from all across the country, and then had it shipped to the airbase in Germany. As word spread further, major candy companies like Hershey's began to get involved and donated as much as they could towards the effort. In the end, the Berlin Airlift was in effect for just under a year, ending in mid-May of 1949. In his 6 months of flying, Lieutenant Halvorsen personally flew 126 missions into Berlin. Along with more than 20 other pilots and crew, it is estimated that they dropped more than 250,000 packages for the children of Berlin. In total, for the airlift as a whole, Allied pilots flew more than 278,000 flights into Berlin and carried with them 2.3 million tons of food, coal, medicine, and other essential supplies. The children of Berlin never forgot about Uncle Wiggly Wings. In 2004, a woman named Ursula Junger spoke about being a child in those days. She said, "Gail Halvorsen enchanted the children of Berlin. In truth, it wasn't even about the candy. It was his profound gesture, showing us that somebody cared." Just a year before she gave this interview, she had managed to meet Gail Halvorsen in person for the very first time. She recalls how nervous she was, but he walked into the room, hugged her, and handed her a Hershey's chocolate bar. A woman named Christel Jonger Voss, who had been 11 when she had stood at that airfield fence, wrote about how the daily ritual became a symbol of hope and fun at a time in which both were scarce. Many years later, the mayor of Berlin would go on to say that Halvorsen's deeply human act has never been forgotten. And Halvorsen himself sums it all up rather nicely when he said that the only way to fulfillment in life, real fulfillment that is to serve others. Thank you so much for listening to The Wild History of War. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps us and also allows curious minds just like yourself to discover the show. Well, this podcast is written, hosted, and presented by me, Nick Charlie Key. You can keep up with everything we're doing by joining our communities over on Facebook, Instagram, X, and Discord. All of the links are in the show notes or on our website. If you're hungry for more strange tales from history, why don't you check out my other podcast, The Fantastic History of Food. Strange but true stories from history that in some way involve food. Until next time, thanks for listening.